Hey guys, tonight we're settling in for something a little different. Picture this. It's New Year's Eve, but we're not talking about modern parties or fireworks. Nope, we're going way back to ancient Rome, where the kids didn't have smartphones, TV, or even enough clean water to enjoy a game of Minecraft. But somehow, they managed to have their own weirdly chaotic version of a New Year's celebration. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's take a sleepy journey into the ancient world, where kids celebrated the New Year with rituals, feasts, and probably way more animal sacrifices than you would think. So, let's start with a little context. The Roman calendar wasn't exactly like ours. The months didn't line up neatly with the solar year, and the Romans had this strange habit of occasionally adding extra months to keep the calendar in sync. Talk about a party planner's nightmare. But the official Roman New Year's Day wasn't January 1st like we have today. Nope. The big day was on March 1st, which kind of makes sense, because spring was just around the corner and, well, that's when you'd really want to start fresh. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on December 31st, because that's when the Romans really got into end-of-year celebrations, even though it wasn't technically the new year yet. You see, they loved festivals. So, whether it was December or March, the Roman kids were preparing for a night filled with chaos. But let's float into their world a bit more. Now, imagine you're a Roman child. Your family's probably not living in some grand villa like the emperor's kids. But let's be real. Your life is still way better than the average peasant's. You've got a nice little house with some decorative tiles, a few slaves to handle the really hard work, and maybe even a nice tunic that doesn't smell like wet dog. But what do you do for fun on New Year's Eve? Well, let's just say it's not like the movie Home Alone, where you're sneaking around setting up booby traps for burglars. Roman kids had more important things to do, like waiting for the priest to finish offering sacrifices to Jupiter. Super chill stuff. The first thing that probably stands out is the family feast. Picture a table loaded with food that would make any modern-day kid drool: honey cakes, dates, nuts, figs, roasted meat, and wine, of course. The wine wasn't just for the adults either. In fact, kids were probably sipping a diluted version of wine mixed with water. It was like their version of grape juice, but with a slightly more aged twist. The thing is, this wasn't just a regular meal. No, this was a sacrifice feast, as in, the Romans loved offering things up to their gods. So, as a kid, you might have had to sit there, all wide-eyed, watching as your father sacrificed a goat or chicken to the gods to ensure good fortune for the coming year. And if that wasn't unsettling enough, the whole family would then eat the meat of the sacrificed animal, which wasn't exactly the most appetizing way to celebrate a new start. But hey, who doesn't love a good blood-spattered feast to kick things off? While this whole sacrifice and feast thing was going on, the Romans also had this weird custom where they gave each other gifts, mostly fig wreaths or other symbolic offerings. But let's be honest here. It's 100% possible that you, as a Roman child, got stuck with a bunch of fig leaves and called it a present. No Lego sets, no iPads, just dried fruit and ceremonial tokens that probably made you question your existence as a child. Now, as the night went on, things took an even weirder turn. Romans had these ritualistic games where children could participate, but these weren't the kind of games you'd see in modern-day sports leagues. No, these were more like games of chance. Maybe you'd throw some dice or participate in a competition to see who could make the best offering to the gods. Think of it like an ancient version of Spin the Bottle, but with way more dead animals and way less awkward teenage crushes. Fun, right? But of course, we can't forget that the Romans, despite being civilized on the surface, still liked to dabble in some ritualistic mischief. As the night wore on, there were also some less than child-friendly activities happening around the neighborhood. You see, priests and other religious figures would wander the streets, carrying out sacrifices to ensure good fortune for the coming year. The kids, they were likely tasked with running around the streets, chanting strange prayers and begging the gods for a good harvest. The whole thing felt like a cross between a religious ceremony and a neighborhood party. Except, instead of fireworks, you got loud drums and ceremonial chants. Oh, and there was also the chance of getting a generous donation from local patrons. That's right. New Year's Eve could also be a great time for a child to score extra food or little trinkets from the local merchants. At some point, probably before everyone passed out from the wine or the sheer exhaustion of attending all those religious ceremonies, there would be a family procession where everyone walked around the house. The idea, to chase away any evil spirits from the old year and welcome the new, like a weird medieval version of spring cleaning for your soul. It's unclear how much of this procession kids actually enjoyed after all. It's hard to be excited about a walk when you're carrying a ceremonial broom and chanting phrases that basically translate to goodbye, bad luck. By the time the evening wrapped up, the kids' job was simple. Stay out of the way while the adults finished with their religious rituals and waited for the last scraps of food to disappear. And if you were lucky, you got to sleep under a warm blanket, which was a luxury for many, and dream of the days ahead. But in a way, it was kind of the perfect New Year's celebration for ancient Rome. There was a little bit of everything: feasts, chaos, ritual, and even a tiny bit of hope that the gods would actually make the next year better than the last. And yes, maybe the kids didn't get the best presents or a chance to play the latest ancient version of Monopoly. But they did get something far more important: the chance to be part of a family tradition that stretched back for generations. Sure, that tradition involved goat sacrifices and odd prayers to the gods, but hey, at least they weren't just sitting around playing with dirty sticks and rocks. So, after our little Roman kid has survived the whole sacrifice and wine feast with the delightful fig wreath gift, it's time to think about what came next. Because, of course, New Year's Eve didn't end with just some food, prayers, and a few dice games. No, Roman kids had to do more. They had to participate in this grand spectacle that the Romans called Saturnalia. For those of you who don't know, Saturnalia was a holiday honoring Saturn, the Roman god of agriculture, and it was basically Rome's version of a giant party. The interesting part? For a brief period of time, social norms were completely flipped. Normally, kids were expected to be seen and not heard, but Saturnalia? Well, the kids actually got a bit of power. They were allowed to tell the adults what to do for a change, which is probably a lot more fun if you're a Roman child who just had to watch your father sacrifice a goat for the gods. Imagine that power getting to boss people around, maybe even sneak a little extra wine. Diluted, of course, or demand that your parents do embarrassing things. Kids got to wear their funny hats, essentially silly, colorful headgear, and demand a little bit of chaos. It was like a medieval rebellion, except with less guillotines and more wine-soaked fig cakes. But as you can guess, no Roman celebration would be complete without a little weird superstition. This was a world where rituals weren't just nice to have, they were absolutely necessary. The whole throwing the old year away idea wasn't just a metaphor. Roman kids were taught that every January 1st, the new year had to be greeted properly. If it wasn't, bad luck could creep in and ruin everything. So, naturally, the family would gather to wash away the old year, symbolically wiping off any bad energy or mistakes made the year before. This was often done with a cold splash of water, which I imagine wasn't the most pleasant thing to have happen in the middle of winter, especially when you were already cold, tired, and covered in spilled wine. Now, Saturnalia wasn't just a day for kids to get their fill of chaos. Oh no. It was also the one time during the year when slaves got to join in the festivities. I can hear you thinking, wait, what? Slaves at a party? Are we sure about this? Yes, I'm absolutely sure. For 1 week, Rome's social hierarchy was suspended. The master would serve the servant. And yes, slaves even got to sit at the table with their owners probably for the first time all year. Imagine how confusing that must have been. One moment, you're bossing your slaves around. The next, you're passing them wine. It was like a role reversal game you didn't want to play but got stuck in anyway. For kids, though, This wasn't just an opportunity to boss their parents around, it was the perfect time to sneak a little extra dessert, maybe dip into the wine bowl when the adults weren't looking, or even join in the singing and dancing that went on well into the night. Yes, Romans loved to sing, even though it probably sounded terrible after a few too many cups of watered-down wine. But as a kid, who cared about quality? The point was to join the ruckus, eat as much as you could stomach, and hope that you weren't the one who had to clean up the mess afterward. But there were also games, of course. No Roman celebration would be complete without some sort of competition. And when you're a kid in Rome, you didn't get to play tag or hopscotch. Oh no. You had to compete in more intellectual games. That's right. While the adults were busy engaging in the old rituals and drunken feasts, the kids would sit in a circle and play dice games or engage in mock debates about the year ahead. How's that for fun? A competitive political debate, except with a lot more laughter and significantly less reason. Now, don't go thinking that the games were entirely wholesome. No. In true Roman fashion, some of the more daring kids took it a step further and challenged each other to little hazardous competitions. Picture this. Kids with a bit too much wine in them, standing in a circle, trying to see who could throw rocks the furthest, climb the highest tree without falling off, or in one case, who could endure the most embarrassment by singing loudly in front of everyone. Yes, ancient Romans knew how to push the boundaries of fun. So as you can imagine, by the end of the night, there were a lot of scraped knees, bruises, and seriously bruised egos. And let's not forget about the wild animals. Ah, yes, because every ancient Roman festival had to include some degree of chaos, and what better way to inject some unpredictable excitement than by letting the local wild animals roam free? That's right. Roman children would often be treated to a festival parade of wild animals like lions, bulls, or even the occasional bear. These creatures were often part of the larger festivities and paraded through the streets, much to the delight and occasional horror of kids. Because what's a celebration without a little bit of danger, right? By the time the night ended, the Romans had made sure they honored the gods with enough feasts, prayers, and merriment to fill the entire year. Kids went to bed exhausted from all the ruckus, with their bellies full of honey cakes and wine, their heads spinning from too much dancing, and their minds filled with wild stories of gods and future adventures. And while the adults wrapped up the last of their ritualistic offerings, the children probably fell asleep to the sound of distant laughter and the lingering smell of roasted meats. The Roman New Year wasn't just about resolutions or quiet reflections like we think of today. Oh no, it was a chaotic, raucous, and sometimes confusing mess of food, family, rituals, and a lot of very questionable behavior. But that was New Year's Eve in ancient Rome, a place where kids got to boss the adults around, participate in strange rituals, and still somehow have an absolute blast before they fell asleep under the weight of their busy little heads. So, when you look back on your own childhood New Year's celebrations, you might think, well, at least we didn't have to make sacrifices to Jupiter. And you're right. But at least the Romans had fig cakes to console them. All right, so now that we've had our fair share of feasts, sacrifices, and questionable games involving wild animals, let's take a moment to reflect. In Rome, New Year's Eve wasn't just a night to let off some steam after a long year. Oh no, it was a family event. You see, for Roman children, family wasn't just a comforting concept, it was a whole institution. Parents, grandparents, slaves, and even distant relatives would all gather around the same table, and you'd better believe the kids had to make themselves useful. At this point, you're probably imagining a scene full of happy family members with no more complaints than the occasional squabble over who gets the last fig cake. But in reality, Roman family dynamics were a bit more complicated. The father of the household, known as the paterfamilias, was in charge of everything, and I mean everything. This guy didn't just sit around sipping wine and offering sacrifices. No. He also made sure his kids were properly trained in what it meant to be Roman, which, if you were a Roman child, meant you were constantly learning how to behave like a miniature adult. As you can imagine, Being a Roman kid wasn't all fun and games. Sure, you had your New Year's celebrations, but you also had to learn the ways of your family's business, whether it was farming, trading, or if you were lucky enough to be born into nobility, the endless political scheming of your parents' friends. And if your parents were blacksmiths, well, you were probably expected to work the forge after the festivities wrapped up. There was no such thing as taking a break. You learned fast that there was always something to do. But let's face it, free time was rare. So, the New Year's party. That was your moment to shine. Let's get back to those Roman kids, though. While the adults were busy drinking, arguing, and making long-winded toasts to their various gods, the children were off doing what kids do best, finding ways to avoid being lectured by the grown-ups. Now, this didn't mean they didn't have their own fun during the evening. They might have been stuck with the same tedious chores during the rest of the year, but on New Year's Eve, there was a little bit more room for mischief. That's right, mischief. I bet you didn't know that New Year's Eve in Rome was prime time for pranks. Roman kids weren't the type to just quietly sit under a blanket, reading scrolls like some sort of ancient nerds. No, they would sneak around, pull little pranks on the servants, and even attempt to trick the adults. For example, it was considered a great joke if you could steal a wine goblet from your father's table without him noticing. But don't get too excited, because you were also expected to be sneaky about it. Roman society valued subtlety, and pulling pranks meant you were getting in touch with the gods of humor. Yes, that was a thing. But be careful, because if you were caught, you'd probably get scolded in front of the whole family, and no one wanted that. As the evening wore on, it was time for the traditional feast, which of course was followed by even more wine and food. But unlike today's typical New Year's celebrations, where people get all fancy and count down to midnight, Roman kids didn't really care about a clock. They cared more about the feasting and the vibes. So there wasn't exactly a countdown to 12 a.m. like we have today. Instead, Roman kids would just hang around until their parents had had enough wine and were ready to move on to the next phase of the evening. And then, after all the food and fun, there was the final ritual, the one that would send you to bed with your stomach full and your mind on whatever trouble you'd get into tomorrow. The great good luck chant. This was a tradition where the family would all gather together, and each member would chant a phrase like, "May the gods smile upon us this year." Now, I don't know about you, but I find it pretty hilarious to think of kids chanting, "May the gods smile upon us," in a way that's 90% sincere and 10% sarcastic. Maybe the kids were just thinking, yeah, that'll work. Sure, we'll get good luck, maybe. But even after all the chanting, feasting, and mischief, it wasn't really time for the kids to sleep peacefully. Oh no. In fact, some historians suggest that after the Roman New Year's rituals, kids had a hard time sleeping because, well, they were too wound up from all the excitement. Now, consider this. You're lying there, under a blanket made from a rough woolen fabric, your stomach stuffed with fig cakes and your head spinning from too much wine, even though you were supposed to drink the watered-down version. And all around you, the adults are still up, bickering about politics and religion, the clink of their wine goblets echoing in the distance. So, sleep didn't exactly come easy to Roman kids. But you know what? Maybe it didn't need to, because when you're a kid in ancient Rome, New Year's Eve wasn't about the perfect night's sleep or the best ever party. It was about chaos, rituals, and just a hint of hope that the gods wouldn't be too annoyed with you next year. Now, as much as we'd like to think that Roman kids just chilled with their parents until the whole New Year's celebration fizzled out, there were still some things that had to get done. You see, Roman life wasn't all feasting and chanting. It also came with some, well, less exciting responsibilities even on the big night. You see, in ancient Rome, there were plenty of duties that the kids had to perform after the feast. That's right. Just when you thought you could finally go to sleep with a belly full of honey cakes and a head full of wild stories about Jupiter, the gods, and your uncle's questionable dance moves, guess what? You still had one last task, the cleanup. Yes, the Romans believed in order after chaos. So kids, they didn't get to lounge around and nap like we do after a big family dinner. No, they were expected to help clean up the mess. Now, let's pause and appreciate the reality check here. Picture it. Your parents and other family members had eaten their fill, shared a few too many tipsy toasts to the gods, and are probably snoozing off their wine-induced stupor. And you, a small, probably slightly tipsy child, are left with the piles of leftovers, spilled wine, and the general chaos that followed the feast. Your job? Organize the mess while praying to every god and goddess you can think of that they don't come back and make things worse. But of course, life goes on after the cleanup, doesn't it? So after everything's tidied up well, that's when Roman kids probably got to have some real fun. You know, once the adults were in their wine-induced coma, the kids would sneak back out into the streets. But here's the fun part. Those kids weren't just playing for fun anymore. They were out to get the best of their neighborhood. Let's talk about Roman street games for a second. As much as you might imagine that Roman kids had no hobbies beyond pestering their parents, that's actually far from the truth. The truth is, Roman kids were some of the most competitive little creatures in all of the empire. After the parents went to sleep and the house fell quiet, kids ventured into the streets, where they would gather for some wild, unsupervised fun. Now, you might think these games were all sweet and innocent, like a bit of hopscotch or tag. Nope. These kids were practicing their real-world skills, and that meant throwing rocks at targets. Not for the faint of heart, my friends. You thought you had a dangerous childhood? Try living in Rome, where you might have broken your arm trying to outthrow your friend, or even gotten an accidental jab from a wayward spear. But hey, it wasn't all rocks and sticks. Sometimes they got even more inventive. Roman kids loved to imitate their parents, especially when it came to their jobs and crafts. That's right, while mom and dad worked hard to keep the empire running, the kids would practice being miniature versions of them. So, if you were lucky enough to be the child of a blacksmith, guess what? You were probably hammering some rocks on an ancient anvil to create your very own miniature sword. Or if your family worked in a shop, you could be pretending to run your own little stall in the street. Of course, that's not all Roman kids had to look forward to. There were also the rituals of good luck they performed. Just like how today's kids might throw coins into fountains and make a wish, Roman kids had their own way of making sure the new year was lucky. The difference? Instead of hoping for a big present, Roman kids were hoping to please the gods. So, imagine standing at the gates of your home, tossing small coins into the air while chanting prayers for a good harvest. If you didn't do this, well, good luck surviving another year in the empire. And let's not forget that the Roman world was full of weird creatures and gods, and kids weren't exempt from these bizarre beliefs. You know how today's kids might have imaginary friends? Well, Roman kids often had imaginary gods. They might have prayed to the god of health for a year free from disease, or the goddess of fertility for good fortune. You could basically pray to anyone or anything, and it was perfectly acceptable. So as Roman kids ran around the streets, shouting for good luck, they were simultaneously trying to outsmart the spirits of the land. Very comforting, right? But what really set Roman New Year's apart from modern celebrations was that there were no presents like we're used to. There was no newfangled toy to look forward to. There were no video games or smartphones to distract the kids from the task at hand. The best thing a Roman child could expect on New Year's Eve was a few coins, maybe a tiny toy made out of clay, or if they were lucky, a fig wreath. And when you compare that to today's reality, where kids expect the world for Christmas, well, it's a bit of a shock to the system. So, as the evening wore down, what was left? The kids would snuggle into their rough, woolen blankets, probably slightly tipsy from the watered-down wine, and drift off to sleep. Roman kids didn't get peaceful sleep. They didn't have dreams of sugar plums or fireworks, but instead, they had the comforting knowledge that they survived another Saturnalia, learned some new skills, and got one step closer to being part of the empire's next big project. What did that mean? Well, they didn't quite know, but they probably felt like they had earned their place in history, even if that place was just under a pile of dirty blankets with an occasional rat trying to make a home under the floorboards. So now, as the children of Rome settled into their little makeshift beds, stuffed with straw and blankets that probably smelled more like wet wool than comfort, the festivities slowed to a quiet murmur. The sounds of clinking goblets and drunken laughter would echo down the streets of Rome for a little while longer. But the kids, they had earned their rest. And let's be honest, they probably needed it. Between the feasts, the chaotic sacrifices, and all those wild games that involved things like throwing rocks at each other, the kids were ready for some peace. And by peace, I mean the type of peace that came with a full stomach and no one telling you to clean up the mess. Just a nice, long sleep before the chaos of the next day kicked in. The interesting thing about the New Year's celebration for Roman kids wasn't just about food and games. It wasn't about the fig wreaths or the tiny gifts they received. It wasn't even about the fact that they were technically celebrating a new year without a clock to count down the moments. What made this celebration special was that for just one night, the rigid hierarchy of Roman society seemed to fade away. The kids got a glimpse of power, a brief moment when they could boss around the adults, even if it was only by asking for a little extra fig cake, or wear their funny hats and pretend to be something more than the future citizens that they were destined to become. But, as we all know, kids don't get to stay in charge for too long. The next morning, they'd be back at the grind sweeping floors, working at their family business, or learning to be future citizens of Rome. They'd be back to pretending to plow the fields, smash rocks, or pretend to run their family's trade shop. Their childhood was a blend of freedom and responsibility, a life full of odd little joys mixed with hard work and the expectation that someday soon they'd be adults. Roman kids didn't have the luxury of endless play. Their time was short. But for that one night, they got a little piece of fun, a brief moment where the gods might smile on them and they could take part in something bigger than themselves. So as the morning sun broke over the hills of Rome, those kids might have woke up a little groggy, with a stomach full of fig cakes and a head full of chaotic memories from the night before. They might have even forgotten half of what happened, but what they remembered, and what probably stuck with them forever, was that one night, just one night, they were part of the action. They didn't just get to watch the adults in charge. They didn't just have to follow the rules. For a few hours, they were in the center of it all, throwing dice and doing things they weren't supposed to. It was their night to feel important. And isn't that what we all want on New Year's Eve? To feel like we matter? That we're part of something bigger? For Roman kids, it was just the briefest taste of that feeling. And to be honest, it probably didn't last long. But for that one evening, it was enough. And as the evening turned to morning, the children would sleep soundly, knowing that the gods had been appeased for another year. Their parents had eaten their fill of roasted meats, and that they had survived another Saturnalia. The next New Year's would be just as messy, just as wild, and just as filled with wine-soaked prayers to the gods of good luck. And so, as the celebrations came to an end, and Roman kids drifted off to sleep in their humble homes, they might have wondered what the new year would bring. Would it be more of the same, or would it be filled with new adventures, new games, and new mischief? But for now, it was time to rest, dream of the next day's adventures, and of course hope that the gods didn't send any more wild animals into the street for a while.